Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Amira's Champion Every Voice podcast, where we elevate the voices of educators and thought leaders who are creating meaningful experiences for students every day. I'm your host, Jaclyn Wright, educator and community engagement manager here at Amira Learning. I'm really excited about today's conversation because we're talking about literacy at scale, from state policy all the way to classrooms, and what it truly takes to support students and educators in powerful ways. I'm joined today by Joe Siedlecki, Chief Impact Officer at Amira Learning. Joe, thank you so much for being here with me today. And as I always say, let's get this reading party started. How are you today, Joe?
I'm good. I'm good. Excited to connect.
Awesome. Can you please share a little bit about your professional journey and how you became Chief Impact Officer at an ed tech company?
Yeah, I would say, and I tell folks this, I had never in my life thought I would be selling ed tech to anybody, but I'd spent a good 15 or so years in the education space, most recently as the Associate Commissioner for School Improvement, System Support and Innovation at the Texas Education Agency for 5 years. And that's where I first came across Amira. Every year, our school improvement team would find the 10 campuses in the state of Texas that had the biggest gains in RLA and the biggest gains in math. And in my last year there, four of the 10 biggest gainers in reading language arts were using Amira. And I know it was a silver bullet, but it was interesting for me to see that pop up. So I went and visited a school, saw it in action, and was blown away. So reached out to Mark Angel, the co-founder and CEO, and I learned a little bit more about the company, and he invited me to join. So that's how I ended up here. For me, the real opportunity was something that you mentioned earlier in your intro, which is driving reading gains at scale. I thought it was something that my own kids could have benefited from, something that I did see kids in Texas already benefiting from, and I thought it would be a good way to spend some time trying to ensure that more kids have access to the support they need to help them learn how to read. And that's how I ended up at Amira. So that's a little bit about my kind of professional journey. I had spent some time previously at the Michael Susan Dell Foundation, the White House Office of Management and Budget, Deloitte Consulting along the way.
Outstanding. So lots of experience that you're bringing to Amira. And you mentioned looking at student outcomes in your role in the state education agency in Texas. How do you define impact in your role today through your background and the lens that you have? That's so
Yeah, I would say today, in my role today, I really look at it in two ways. One is that the tool, Amira, continues to generate a significant impact on students' reading ability. So it's really just ensuring that the product continues to deliver on the promise that it was designed on. I think, Jackie, but some listeners might not know that Amira started at Carnegie Mellon in 1993. It was an R&D project there called Project Listen. And one of the ethos behind the development of that project, which ultimately became the product Amira, was to constantly evaluate, iterate, and improve the experience for students. And that's something that sticks with us today. One way to define impact is reading growth for students who use the tool. The second way to define impact is trying to ensure as many students as possible are getting access to the tool. So it's both ensuring efficacy as well as widespread adoption. Those are the two metrics that drive my daily activities.
Absolutely. And Joe, I can attest to how Amira strives to meet the mark over time. I met Amira in 2019 and began using her and implementing Amira as a principal around 2020. And so I've seen the efforts that our team takes to continue to meet the mark when it comes to the needs of kids. And so I want to applaud you guys and our leadership for still making sure that the impact again is tied directly to what we're seeing with kids each and every day. So thanks for that, Joe. Let's talk about the national literacy landscape. What are you seeing right now in the literacy landscape across states, districts, and classrooms where progress is happening or where challenges still persist? So, what are the progress that you're seeing and challenges as well?
Yeah, I think there's great progress in a number of states on some what I would call longer term levers. So things like the science of reading aligned teacher training. So there's efforts in Texas called the Reading Academies. There's efforts in many states to ensure that all educators are educated on the science of teaching reading. So I think that's one thing that we see sweeping across the nation. Probably one of the first things. More recently, we've seen efforts along two lines. One is to ensure that all students and all districts have access to tools to help screen and assess students in the early grades so that they can more quickly identify students with gaps in their reading skills and abilities and knowledge, background knowledge, and then try to fill those gaps sooner. So you see a wide number of states adopting legislation or creating RFPs to evaluate and select one or a small number of screeners or assessments that can be used in grades K through 3. Third thing that we see consistently across a lot of states, which is to be applauded, which is an effort to identify high quality instructional materials. So those things that actually have some research base or evidence base in the science of reading and generate knowledge and skills for kids in many states are similarly creating lists of acceptable or incentivized HQAM to adopt. So I think those are kind of three things that we see happening in many states. I think one thing that's maybe not as prevalent, but ought to be, which is identifying supports that could move the needle even faster. So when I think of teacher training and screening and HQAM, to me, those are longer term plays. They take several years to adopt and implement. And I think that there ought to be some attention paid to, okay, so what do we do now to drive reading gains and improve reading ability this year or next year and not down the line. I think both are necessary. I think there's been a big push on policies and activities for that medium and longer term kind of foundation. I think we need some quick wins, if you will, for kids.
I can imagine, Joe, from your perspective and your lens, nationally and internationally, you've probably seen within the last 5 or 6 years where states are adopting this legislation to make sure that all of the pieces that you just mentioned are part of the law for that state and how they provide literacy, instruction, and access to students. And speaking of state legislation and laws and policies, what do you most often see in the gaps between literacy policy intent and then what's actually showing up with those classroom teachers and students?
Yeah, it's a great point. Policy is one thing, successful implementation is another, and there's a big gap between the two. Obviously, there has to be a lot of effort put on the building capacity of school systems, school leaders, and teachers to implement these policies, but also attention needs to be paid to how do we simplify this as much as possible, right? The idea of adopting high quality instructional materials is one thing, right? That's something a state can require and districts can then select from, but then districts need to implement. And the teacher in the classroom is pretty far removed from, say, the governor. So intent is one thing, and implementation's another. Lots of effort, and we see this in many states, following through all the way down the chain so that the student actually benefits from the policy. And this is one reason why I'd mentioned before, like this need to focus a little bit more on what I would say is like the fastest path to growth while we're implementing and adopting high quality instructional materials across the country,
Yes.
also providing opportunities for kids to learn immediately, maybe in ways that don't require as massive of a shift in organizational or institutional behavior. Like I said, we shouldn't abandon that. It's absolutely the right thing to do, but also need to take that perspective of what can we help kids access immediately that's going to drive some results. And an example of that is Amira. Another example of that is high impact human tutoring, right? Which is a little bit more difficult to scale, but similarly something that many studies have shown, as they have with Amira, that you can see improvements in reading ability pretty quickly after engaging in those types of activities.
And you mentioned making sure that students have the access and the ability to learn, and that we provide them with that access faster and better ways. And a way that we do that at Amira is by developing this learning agent that gives them that. And we use AI to do so. What does responsible agentic use of AI in literacy look like?
Yeah.
Why does that
So,
distinction matter?
yeah, it's a great question. I'll try to distill it as best I can. I think responsible agentic AI, first and foremost, is AI that was purpose built. What I mean by purpose built is that the AI was created with a specific task in mind of helping students learn how to read. right?
Mhm.
It's one thing for a company or an organization to make use of commercial tools that exist out there like Claude and ChatGTP and related tools, but those weren't built specifically to help kids learn how to read. So I think responsible AI is purpose built. Responsible AI is closed loop, meaning that none of the data that is in the system leaves the system. It's all used simply for reinforcement and improvement inside of the tool or the product, right? So to me, those are the two most important things for responsible AI is that it's purpose built and that it is closed loop.
Absolutely. Joe, recently I was able to attend a session with Mark in Texas for TASA. And during that experience, Mark shared a presentation that not all AI is created equal. And it was eye opening for me. You were a part of my transition from public education to ed tech. And so I'm still learning so much about how the AI works. But in that presentation, Mark shared that school district leaders should be asking companies like ours, how do I know this is safe and where is my data going? Do you have any guidance for school district leaders who might be looking to make sure that products or learning agents are safe? What's your advice to them?
Yeah, I think it's ask. I would say that there's maybe three broad-based questions to ask in that regard. One is, it was your product built, was the AI built with the purpose in mind of improving reading ability? Second is your system closed loop? Does the data collected ever leave this system? And then the third, I would say, is like, is there any evidence that this product actually delivers on its promise of improving reading ability, right? Those three things are pretty straightforward questions that a school superintendent or chief technology officer could ask of any vendor that's claiming to use AI in their product.
What would be important to me is the alignment of, as a chief academic officer or school leader, it would be important to me to know that the curriculum, instruction, and technology would remain aligned if we did decide to use agentic learning or a piece like Amira.
Yeah.
What does it look like in daily instruction when there is coherence with the learning agent and the school district's resources that they decide to use?
Yeah, absolutely. Coherence is a buzzword in reading circles today. It's an important one. In the past, we've had a mishmash of various products, services, PD, curriculum that may have been at the surface level, all pointing in the same direction, but not truly coherent and aligned. I do think the coherence matters. It's a matter of simplicity and kind of reinforcement for kids that they're not getting seemingly random bursts of information or skills in different places. So to me, what coherence means is that what's being taught in the classroom is being reinforced, and any supplemental or intervention activities, what's being assessed, whether that's formative, diagnostic, or interim assessed, is actually looking at what students have learned. So to me, coherence, for example, on a product would be teachers are teaching a lesson on bridges in the second 10 weeks of third grade. When students are working in a tool like Amira, they're reading about bridges. When teachers are notified that a student has certain gaps on either knowledge or skills, that the tool that they're using drives them back to their curricular resources from their HQAM. So to me, it's just a matter of constant reinforcement, both putting coherent, aligned content in front of kids, but also supporting teachers by directing them back to resources that are in their own core curriculum that are the things that students need maybe more work on.
Absolutely. Speaking of the teachers and the leaders that have to make the decisions around the resources and agents that will be used, let's talk about trust, autonomy, and accountability. How should leaders balance accountability, educator autonomy, and technology so tools like Amira strengthen and don't constrain professional practice?
Hmm.
How do you balance accountability, autonomy, and tech so that it doesn't constrain the teachers, but it supports their professional practice?
That's a good question. I need to think a little bit about that one. I might put a little bit of a slightly different spin on it and start by just saying that whatever tool is used ought to be assisting or supporting teachers and not replacing them, right? So that's first and foremost. In terms of kind of accountability and trust, I'd say, look, if you're a school system and you're selecting a tool that has consistent, independent evidence of effectiveness, then It's more about you can have some trust in the product per se, and you're building capacity of educators to help implement it and monitor it with some degree of fidelity. I don't know if I'm really getting the answer to your question, Jackie.
Yeah, you are getting to the meat of the question. And for me, it's is it going to be an additional burden for the teachers who are already burdened? Their jobs are already so tough. And so how can we leverage the agentic learning piece and partner
Gotcha.
that with the leadership authority to build trust and say, hey, teachers, this is not to add to your plate. We're going to lighten your load with this, and this is how.
Yeah. Look, the way I would view this is I apply the same kind of idea to many different things, but anything that you're going to put in front of teachers or in classrooms needs to help them simplify their work, prioritize, and execute. And teaching students how to read is not a simple task, right? But what I mean by that is we shouldn't introduce anything that adds additional layers of complexity to something that's already predictably complex. So when you're designing a product or selecting one, you want to look for something that's simple. Teachers prioritize their very limited time, and it helps them execute on the things they need to do in order to help kids to better learn how to read. Right. So if a tool meets all three of those things, I think it's actually going to be a more valuable addition to the teacher classroom and the teacher experience than one that is complex, not aligned, and actually just provides too much information and doesn't help them prioritize what they need to do. So simplify, prioritize, and execute. Those would be the three things that I would say are an important consideration in selecting any tool that's going to be of assistance to teachers and kids.
I agree with you 100%, Joe. You couldn't have explained that any better. And as a matter of fact, one of the main sentiments of our teachers was how simple Amira made things for them with teaching literacy. Some of them had not been trained in the science of reading yet, and they felt a sense of relief knowing they had a partner or an agent there to help them with any gaps that they might miss due to lack of training because they might be so early in their careers. So, thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to leadership at scale. What moves have you seen make the biggest difference when states or districts pursue literacy improvement at scale? Does it go back to the policies they put in place?
Well, policies are important, but I think I'm a big believer in frameworks. And I'd say one thing that I've seen some states do, like Louisiana, that I think actually make a real big difference, Texas would be another example too, is they create some clarity around the language to use and the expectations from the state agency all the way down to the classroom. Schooling can be an incredibly complex endeavor. And there is a lot of terminology, lingo that is around all various subspecialties, right? Whether it's math, reading, science, pedagogy, you name it. One thing I think that states and districts can do is, again, coming back to this theme of trying to simplify, which is the creative framework that creates a common language so that when school leaders or school districts are speaking to one another about various things, they're using the same framework to describe what they're doing. And a good example of that is something that we created in Texas called the Effective Schools Framework, which has now been further blown out into the Effective District Framework. And it just says, look, there's 5 things that effective schools do really well. We're going to have a common language around these things so that when we're trying to improve, one district in, say, West Texas and the district in South Texas can have a conversation using similar language. Those 5 things are strong school leadership and staffing, strong school culture, high quality instruction materials, effective assessments, and deep parent engagement. And you can fit pretty much a lot of the work that goes in schools into those big broad buckets. But to me, in order to drive success and implementation, you have to take policy, put it into some sort of framework or common language, and then align resources and incentives and supports around those elements of the framework. And if you can do those things, you get an entire system working towards a result instead of disconnected or loosely connected kind of acts of goodness.
Thank you, Joe. What advice do you have for those school districts or leaders who may be afraid to implement a learning agent or may think that AI isn't safe? What would be your stance to them? And the reason I ask this question a lot of time of our thought leaders, Joe, is because of the work we engage in here at Amira. Our CEO, he wants us to be AI native, and he expects the employees here to implement AI tools to make sure that we can have more capacity and do our best, our very best work. And so teachers are preparing this next workforce, right? So, what do you encourage those school leaders and those districts to do who are afraid to implement AI now with students who they should be preparing for tomorrow's workforce that is going to implement and it require them to utilize AI expertly?
Yeah, I think fundamentally schools' roles are to prepare citizens for the future.
Right.
One of the most important, maybe the most important thing to do in that regard is to teach people how to read. You
Yep.
unlock the ability to read, you unlock the massive human potential that everyone has, right? So I would say if there's districts that are concerned about using AI, completely makes sense, right? It can be a very scary thing. I would just go back to some of the things we talked about a little bit earlier, right? When you're making those decisions, make sure that the tools you built are purpose built for that specific reason, that they're closed loop, and most importantly, and this is the most important one, is that they actually have independently evaluated evidence of success in driving the outcome that they say they can drive. And if you are selecting tools not based on their features, but on the outcomes they produce, I think you'll be in a safer space with your teachers and with your students because you can see the result of it. I would advise against using AI for AI's sake and choosing tools because they have AI. Tools ought to be chosen because they generate a result and not because the company says they do, but because there's independent evaluations that show that they do.
Wow. Thank you, Joe, for sharing that perspective. I love that you said that we shouldn't just be picking resources because now we're in this AI wave and AI is the big buzzword or it's popular. You should be picking the best resources that meet the need or the outcome that you've established. Awesome.
Yeah.
Joe, what does leadership joy look like to you?
Joy, like J-O.
Joy, leadership joy. What does
Me
that
personally, and this is like, is just, yeah, as a leader, it's bringing people onto the team that see success, right? So the most joy that one can experience as a leader is helping the folks that they're working with become the best version of themselves and the most successful version of themselves. So to me, that's leadership. That's leadership joy. If I were to apply that to a superintendent, it's bringing on cabinet level folks who you can support in generating success. If that's a principal, it's helping teachers hit it out of the park. And if it's a teacher, it's helping kids, for example, in this case, learn how to read, right? That's leadership. And leadership joy is helping folks see success. The other thing I'd say is leadership is a transfer of belief. This space is a complex one and very difficult one, and we need to be able to believe that we can make a difference. So, to me, another version of leadership joy is transferring the belief that we can be successful at the various endeavors that we're pursuing.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Joe. I only have one last prompt for you, and I
Okay.
can't wait. I can't wait to hear you do it. This one is give me your best, your very best. Let's get this reading party started. Will you give me
Oh my
one,
goodness.
please?
I'm pretty stoic here, but I'll give it a let's get this reading party started.
Good job, Joe. You knocked that out of the park. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, your leadership, your background, and your expertise with us today. Your voice reminds us that lasting literacy change only happens when policy, practice, purpose, and people are truly aligned. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today for another episode of Amira's Champion Every Voice podcast. Keep supporting educators and keep giving every child a chance to become a reader. Until next time.